Good morning, everyone. I welcome you at your screens. This will be an hour-long discussion on EU trade. And I have to say that COVID pandemic has caused all kinds of challenges to all of us, and the economic crisis is one among them. And now the second wave and all the strict restrictions overtaking Europe is a very serious test for our economics, and working on the recovery of economy. The European Commission is reviewing EU trade policy. Also, before the pandemics, trade was filled with challenges. We know relationships with China, United States, relationship with United States, also stagnation of the World Trade Organization, and this is just a cherry on the top. We will be talking about trade, why, with whom, and how Europe should be trading to reach recovery of our economy. We have four panel speakers. Valdis Dombrovskis, who is the Executive Vice President of European Commission, and he also now holds the position of the Commission for Trade. Good morning. We also have Rihards, who is the chairperson of the Committee of Foreign Affairs of the Parliament, and he has been in the working group working on trade as well. We also have the Parliamentary Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Zanda, Kalniņa-Lukaševica, and she represents also Latvian trade councils in Brussels, but today we welcome you in Riga. We also have with us Normunds Bergs, who is a chairperson of the board, Tehnika company, and also member of the Council of Chamber of Trade and Industry, and he is a very active exporter. Welcome. So we are having this virtual meeting. Some of the experts are in Riga, some are in Brussels, but since the civic dialogue is involving more participants, so it's possible to follow this online. On the Facebook page of the Representative Office of the European Commission in Latvia, you can choose English or Latvian. Then also Latvian Public Broadcasters Portal, LSM, and this discussion will be held in Latvian, but we are providing also interpretation into English, and tvnet.lv streaming in Latvian. Before we start the discussion, some organizational matters. To run it all smoothly and not to waste time on all kinds of technical issues, so we don't have to repeat the question, do you hear me? We provide the possibility to put your questions in writing. If you follow us on Facebook, you can write comments. If you are using Zoom, you can write your questions in the chat box, and you can write in Latvian or in English. But we will be, of course, speaking in Latvian, and the interpretation will be provided. But before we start the discussion, I will give the floor to Andris Kuznieks, who is the acting head of the Representation Office of the European Commission. I greet you all from the House of the European Union. I'm very happy that we can continue discussions on topics that are relevant for the European Union on this occasion in online form. And I'm also very happy that we are going now to have the first discussion to discuss the European Union trade. And in some ways, we have an exclusive opportunity, because from the beginning of this month, Valdis Dombrovskis has entered office of the Commissioner for Trade of the European Commission. And I don't think that international trade is something very distant and foreign. This is a relationship with China, with distant regions, but it affects all of us, all the individuals, all companies, because Latvia, being an open economy, is export-oriented. And that's why all those relevant matters in the European Union, and also the perspective from the European Union and from Latvia is very important. So I wish to all of you high-quality discussion, interesting questions, and I thank everyone for involvement. Well, thank you, Andris Kužnieks. Now we'll have some questions for warming up and answers up to 5 minutes, and then we will take the questions from the listeners and the viewers. As I mentioned, trade within the EU and outside before COVID was taking place in a very quite complex environment, because sometimes trade is used for reaching geopolitical aims. And somehow people feel convinced that benefits from technology and trade are not really, the benefits are not divided equally. But we will show you now a chart, and we will see that COVID crisis has made all these problems more obvious. And here we see it's the import and export change, and we see the declining line during spring, and full recovery has not taken place over summer months. The forecasts of the Commission show that economy will decrease by 8.3%, and new forecasts will be now next week, and global trade decrease 10 to 16%. And that's why, of course, Commission is working and intensifying the work on the recovery plan. So I have the following question. I have the following question to Valdis Dombrovskis. In view of this very complex trade situation, what should be done? What should be done? What should be done, and what is the role of trade in this whole recovery? Well, good morning once again. First of all, I would like to thank the Representation Office of the Commission in Latvia for organizing this commission. Currently, we are reviewing the trade policy of the European Union, and it's very important to discuss all those matters, not only in Brussels, but also in the member states, together with policy makers, companies, NGOs. And so now we have the public consultation procedure regarding the renewed trade policy, and this will go on until the 15th of November. So I invite all the representatives from Latvia, state institutions, entrepreneurs, NGO sector, provide your proposals for this renewed trade policy. And Ms. Nagla already said, she outlined the range, the circle of those matters that we are now facing. On the one hand, we have economic crisis due to COVID-19 and the negative effect upon trade. On the other hand, in general, international trade situation where we see conflicts and problems, and more so compared to previous years. So the context in general is quite complicated. The main aims, the main objectives that we want to reach in connection with the renewed trade policy. First of all, we want to ensure we want to maintain rules-based multilateral international trade system. And for that, very serious reform of the World Trade Organization is needed, because currently this organization has very serious problems, both linked to multilateral trade negotiations, which are not really proceeding well, also the appeals system, which is no longer functioning at all. So we really see serious problems, and this is the first very important question. We have to maintain this international rules-based system. The second important issue is economic crisis, and how could we use trade policy for overcoming this crisis. But we really have to underscore that each seventh job in Europe is linked to export from the European Union, and in general in the European Union we have the trade surplus. And in the coming decade, approximately 80% of the total global economic growth will take place outside the EU. That's why it's quite clear that from the economic perspective as well, it's important for European Union to remain open for international trade, because to a large extent this will ensure jobs and also will help to ensure economic growth within the European Union. So we cannot have protectionistic policy because Europe might end up, European Union might end up being a loser. But of course, taking into account this quite conflicting situation, it's very important for us to protect our interests more actively. This is the next line of activities. More greater activity in protecting the interests of traders from Europe and taking measures in those situations when third countries do not meet the commitments that they have undertaken in bilateral organizations or within the World Trade Organization. And the last important, again, set of questions is linked to European policy priorities in general. That's also green and digital transformation of Europe. And we really have to look at how trade policy could help in meeting these general European policies.
Thank you, Mr. Dombrovskis. Please do show the next chart. There we can see trade of goods throughout the world in each and every country. And the blue, dark blue, these are the countries which has the European Union as the main partner for trade. You can see that it represents the majority. Trade policy and its role we saw this year when demand for all kinds of protective devices are needed. Also, our resilience or ability to be resilient is of topical issue. That's why I will ask a question to Rihards Kols. How else, in what different ways we could strengthen ourselves, or maybe we should strive for becoming even a bigger trade partner? Yes, thank you very much for this ability to express what Parliament thinks. Any free trade agreements are necessary. Moreover, if there are internal and external crises, and it was also true in the crisis of 2008, when internal GDP was weak and we had demand only from developing countries or outside of Europe. That's why we have our priorities, and EU has its priorities, and we can identify very clearly what the challenges are on a local level, within Europe, in the internal market, because we have trade inside of EU. In Latvia, it's, for example, 70%. We have our trade partners mainly in Europe. That's why we can use the instruments also internally and globally in order to foster international trade, as Mr. Dombrovskis already mentioned. But we should observe international trade principles, and all the players play by the rules. And what is at the moment in parallel happening to pandemics, trade wars are not helping. That's why additional effort must be made for by Europe in order to not to diminish the existing rules, existing requirements, but to strengthen them also by World Trade Organization. During the pandemics, we have digitalized service of a more demand, which is something new, and many things are being done in order to promote and do that, and EU can be the leading player in this endeavor. And we all know, and the world also recognizes, that the EU is a superpower if we speak about requirements, standards, regulations. And this is the added value for EU if we speak about new trade agreements. At this moment, EU has to look back what has happened with the existing trade agreements, but we have to step into signing new trade agreements. There are many obstacles and many challenges, as Madam Nagle already mentioned. Transatlantic trade agreement. Our parliament had a working group dedicated for this agreement, but I don't think that the existing agreements couldn't work as blueprints for future trade agreements. It is certain that those trade agreements are signed on equal grounds. No one has been jeopardized, be it because of standards or be it because of fair competition. But this is the right moment to talk about new regulatory framework for these agreements. At the same time, World Trade Organization, as well as EDSO, has to play a big role, especially speaking about digitalization. OECD very recently came up with guidelines for coming up with a digital tax or digital taxation, when even more digitalization will be dictating our daily life. I think this will become true one day, because we are using digital services, not only in order to protect our entrepreneurs, but also to set international standards dictating digital questions. So this is all I wanted to say about this question. Thank you very much, Rihards Kols. I wanted to come up with yet another chart as to what raw materials and whether or how much Europe needs raw materials. Here you can see charts. We can see that needs are many, and trade is a key to satisfy these needs. How do we obtain those raw materials? And now the question to Zanda Kalniņa-Lukaševica, Parliamentary Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. What do we hear from other ministries of foreign affairs all around Europe, and how we can come up to a strategic model of strategic autonomy, and what is strategic autonomy? Thank you. Thank you also the representation of European Commission for organizing this discussion. It is very positive and very natural that some aspects have been already said by Mr. Dombrovskis and Mr. Kols as to what I wanted to say. Speaking about strategic autonomy and how EU understands it, member states are at the moment formulating or coming up with a notion of it, and there has been only one Council of Ministers where we discussed trade policy review and analyzed these questions as to opened strategic autonomy. That's why also Latvia is at the evaluating stage, and this concept has to be looked at in conjunction with industry policy and some other policies. In generally, we support this approach. We have to diminish risks. We have to verify supply chain. We may not be so dependent from one supplier. At the same time, we should take care of not losing balance between trade protection, market protection, which is very, very crucial, and openness of market, because protectionism is yet another risk that we should be careful about. there are specific problems also made stronger by the pandemics. At this moment, I wanted to say that for Latvia, it is very important that, trade is still opened based on honest rules where all parties involved, be it a consumer, be it a supplier, as well as entrepreneur, that they are treated well. There are three priorities for our trade policy. Latvia wants to see changes in the trade environment for the benefit of smaller players, in order for small and medium enterprises to flourish. It has to be in the center of everything. And this new trade policy has to foster development of small, medium enterprises in order for them to become also partners in the supply chain. And it has to be strengthened by new agreements. The second thing, verification of trade policy. We have to look for new export opportunities, thinking about economic development after crisis of COVID-19. That means we have to continue working on new trade agreements, on signing them, as well as reviewing and expanding an application of existing trade agreements. There have been very good trade agreements already set by Australia, by Mercosur and other countries, as well as others. But at the same time, it is not enough that we just expand the network of free trade agreements. They have to be implemented, and we have to monitor them and follow that our partners honor what they have signed under. That's why we look forward this new institution, the supervising authority of implementation of trade agreements, to set in. Also, we want to diminish unfair competition, which is more prominent in our relationship with China. And we have to be able to react if our interests are breached. And all of that has to be based on multi-approach trade order. That's why, the trade organization has to undergo a reform. And we support Commission's work in their endeavors as to trade agreement reform, especially speaking about Green Deal, green development, digital trade, and others. In conclusion, our trade policy has to be able to keep global economy opened. The trade should be free and honest, and equal competition rules should be in place.
Thank you. And now let's take a look at another figure, at another chart. Here we see a situation in Latvia external trade. And here we see that we import more than we export. And this has been like this for years. And so my question now to Normunds Bergs, who is an exporter and board member of a company, Tehnika, and member of the Chamber of Trade and Industry. What the company should do to become more competitive, and what kind of support would you expect from EU trade policy? And Valdis Dombrovskis hears us. He's working on changing EU trade policy. So this is the right moment, the right time to come up with your wish list, like with Santa Claus. Actually, I had to put it all in writing and send it all, and then just get Mr. Dombrovskis to agree publicly to this. But well, I will be serious now. We have to understand that in the context of the European Union, any business of Latvia is just a small, microscopic, and probably perhaps we have about approximately 10 companies which are bigger or outside the definition of small and medium enterprise of the European Union. So we cannot have direct influence upon geopolitical trade agreements. Our impact would be quite minor, except for those areas where these trade agreements indeed take away some non-tariff barriers or prohibitions, like in medicine, food production, highly regulated areas. But let's be realistic. In these areas, the situation with trade agreements are most difficult. So coming back to the needs, how to increase our competitiveness, how to sell more. We used to say we have to find oil in Latvia and we'll be happy ever after. Now it's no longer fashionable. Oil is no longer in fashion. And also, let's be realistic. Probably we won't dig out anything that we have here. So what we can only offer products with high added value. And here we have to think about applied science and also money coming from the European funds for creating new products and improving the existing ones. Now we have really heated discussions among the representatives of producers and with public administration, because we believe that this sector is not receiving sufficient attention. And only when the sector which is really producing will be able to create more and better products, we will have some hopes to sell more, because those agreements are of little help to us. If we have products with low, small added value, so if you are just selling some kind of boards, and other some kind of timber products with low added value, nothing will really change. What else the European Union could do? If we want really to be honest, there's no European Union. We have the member states of the European Union. We have huge problems of logistics, and pandemics showed it and revealed it, that many companies had to suspend their production, not because they were unable to produce, but they were unable to supply their products within the EU and also outside. And here I believe for the Union it would be very important to consider some kind of mechanisms within the EU and also outside the EU to supply our goods within a reasonable time and swiftly. And I have suspicions that the things are not going to go well quite soon again, because if we look now at the second wave, I believe that a large part of the Western world will sit at homes locked in. It's quite obvious. However, about selling outside, I think I'm not speaking about America now. We will speak about it perhaps on the 4th of November at some point, some later point when we see the new administration. I don't want to speak about the British business. Perhaps Mr. Dombrovskis knows when we'll be able to speak substantially what's happening with the British, what kind of market, what kind of Brexit we are going to have. But about Africa and South America, where we have been working as a company for more than 20 years, we and Europe in general are being forced out, pushed out by China. And we saw it also on that map, on that graph. And again, the reason is not liberalization of trade or agreements, but the reason is that in those regions, we see huge direct investments coming from China. And if you have a telecom operator or energy company owned by China or food producer, any company, then irrespectively of all those terms of international agreements, of course, China's suppliers will be the preferred ones, and those trade agreements will give no advantage to Europe because the client has been designed in a way not to buy from you. And so my proposal would be to develop European investment policy. If within those territories where we see that development is forecast, European investments come, then trade will follow. Well, of course, this whole picture is not flat. It's not drawn on paper. It has many dimensions, and we have to look at all those dimensions. And when we should use broader spectrum. Probably I have exhausted my 5 minutes, but just another thing that I would really like to see. Circulation of documents in Europe. I remember when we just accessed to the EU and when we were the presiding state, and I asked this very naive question: why couldn't we have such electronic signature that would be accepted by all member states? And more than 10 years have passed and nothing has happened in this respect. So we are still very fragmented in general. And I understand that it's really a very hard matter, but we have to start working on it. Perhaps then we will get to a solution within a decade. But in general, I am quite positive.
Before we ask your question, I wanted one comment from Mr. Dombrovskis. We heard the list of needs from one of the entrepreneurs who has a great experience. What can be done from the list that he told us about? Thank you very much for the questions and also for your comments. Reacting to some things that have been said by previous speakers, first of all, about focus on SME and support for them. This focus in our review of trade policy will be there. We are doing a lot about this policy. Half a year ago, there have been a strategy for SMEs adopted. It's not just for trade policy, but for policy in general, and it will be very much in the center of speaking about trade agreement. Recently, we opened access to market portal, and there is information about accessing more than 120 partners, and this information was aimed at SMEs because big companies have legal support and they can solve these issues by themselves. But SMEs do have bigger problems when finding partners. Similar, if there are trade disputes, we ensure by this portal that claims from SMEs against third countries are looked at, and EU will use our instruments against those third countries. Those issues are in the agenda of renewed policy. Speaking about the chains of supply, it is a problem. We started solving it in March and April, when from member states there were many uncoordinated actions, mainly on our borders. Then we made sure that at least critical goods, namely foodstuff and medical goods, are delivered on time, and the result is that the delivery of those goods are quite normal still. Speaking about the third countries, situation is more difficult. Delivery of goods is still going on, but not so smoothly as before, because we all understand that international flights have almost ceased to exist, and third countries are also coming up with their restrictions, and we cannot control them. Speaking about investment policy, and its link with trade, you mentioned Africa and South America. Speaking about Africa, our investments in Africa is much bigger than investments of China. The question is how successfully we use those investments in order to reach our trade goals, and that question should be evaluated more closely, because if I look at the investment amounts, we all think that China is investing a lot and China is everywhere, but looking at pure facts, EU is a bigger investor in, for example, Africa than China. So the question is how we can use it. Speaking about digital agenda and unified digital signature or e-signature, this question is really dragging on for a long time, and it is on our digital agenda of the EU, be it e-signature or circulation of digital documents within the EU. It is important to solve these issues. Thank you, Mr. Dombrovskis. And now we will tackle your questions, because there are many questions coming from Facebook in the part of comments, but those who use Zoom, you can ask your question in chat box. If we will not be able to answer all your questions, we will try to access you afterwards and answer your questions. The question that has been sent in by Jānis Bukovskis and Ojārs Kehris, what's the likelihood if a trade agreement with the U.S. will be signed if Biden is elected, and how much it's likely in case if Trump is elected, and how our position towards World Trade Organization is going to change after U.S. elections. If we speak about our trade relations with the U.S., lately they have been problematic in the last years, but we have to stipulate the following. We are still strategic partners. We are cooperating on several issues based on common values, and EU and US trade and investment links are the biggest relations internationally, globally. So this cooperation is still very important and very close, and this is our biggest trade partner. How we forecast the development of our relations from our side, from EU side, we are ready to develop our trade relations, but at the same time, if US is going to act unilaterally, then proportionally we will have to respond to that, be it steel and aluminium rates that have been implemented. We did the same towards American goods. But that's not the direction where we would like to go. We want to normalize situation. Quite recently, we have come to an agreement as to certain liberalization of our trade, and we have to continue working that way. Speaking about overarching free trade agreement with the EU, between EU and US, the expectations are not too big, neither in case Trump wins or Biden wins. Mr. Kols mentioned already TTIP agreement. Those negotiations ended in nothing, TTIP negotiations. So we don't see we can come up with a similar agreement with US in the nearest years, because all problems that were there present in TTIP case are still there, and even more valid in case of our relations with USA. We maybe have to look at it from different aspects, and also cooperation towards reform of World Trade Organization, and how we are going to change, and whether our attitude is going to change. No, the attitude is not going to change, because the EU wants this system based in certain rules and regulations, and for that, World Trade Organization is crucial. The issue is how attitude of USA is going to change. In case of Biden winning, administration of US is going probably to be more active in involving in all kinds of multilateral cooperation negotiations. Mr. Kols?
Yes. I would say that we have several free trade agreements that have been concluded and are valid, and CET agreement is the most ambitious, and it's quite clear that America have concluded with Canada. We can use the possibilities through Canada to United States. But we outlined that 88% of exporters in the EU are SMEs. So we can look at the member states, of course, as the way SMEs are classified, what is small, what is medium. In some Western countries, a medium company for Latvia is a major company. So we see the differences. What I wanted to say by it, I believe that the European Commission should assess the possibility to send trade missions and representations to those countries that have, with that we have a free trade agreement, like Canada, and with those countries that we are going to have in Australia, New Zealand, Mercosur countries, Japan. We understand that each country has its own agency of export attraction and investment attraction, like we have in Latvia, our agency. But if we want, if the European Union wants to reinforce its presence, then setting up of such missions would be acutely needed, involving also representatives from the member states, and that would ensure strong synergy with companies providing information and also representing their rights. That's one point. The other point I wanted to mention is Mr. Dombrovskis already mentioned reform of the World Trade Organization. It really coincides with what Mr. Bergs said about Africa, where in western coast, for example, China dominates with its investment. The EU should invest. And we are also interested, perhaps, in making investments in less developed regions to make these regions attractive for our exporters. So my question is, what is the general policy of the EU with Doha round of negotiations? That's transfer of science and knowledge to less developed regions. Is there some kind of one united position of the EU in the World Trade Organization, or any kind of strategy? Of course, we can export and bring in, but it will not increase the economic growth if the country to which we export is not developing. And the very last point. It's predictable that within 10 to 15 years, approximately 90% of economic growth will happen outside the EU. And this is a clear signal for us that, well, what I said about the trade missions, such trade missions could perhaps make this number higher for the EU. Thank you, Mr. Kols. You asked a very interesting question, but I will still prefer and choose a question from our viewers. We have many questions and very interesting. One person who is watching us on Zoom is asking, what about the local market in Latvia? We are getting into our market pork from Europe because China has prohibited import from Germany because of the disease. How are you going to protect this market? Because the local pork price is below the production costs. So who could take this question? Market protection, Mr. Dombrovskis, anyone? Well, about Latvia's local market, this question should be addressed to the representatives of the Latvian government. But if we speak about the EU trade policy is developed with respect to third countries, because the EU is one single domestic internal market, and international trade policy, actually the European Union acts as one. And if we conclude trade agreements with third countries, that we are concluding these agreements as the European Union, and goods can be imported and exported from any country, any member state of the EU. So the question about the situation in the local market, this should be, well, be resolved locally, of course, taking into account that the EU has this common market. But still, I would like to respond to one of the questions put by Mr. Kols about EU trade missions. The European Commission has delegations in many countries where we indeed have highly developed trade relationships. And in these delegations, we also have trade representatives. And these delegations are open to all EU member states. So if Latvian companies encounter some trade problems in these countries, then they definitely can turn to the delegation of the European Commission in the respective country. Thank you. Zanda, Kalniņa-Lukaševica, anything to add? Thank you. I believe that the difference is when we speak about the internal market, that the EU and the protection against third markets. We have very good mechanisms which function to protect from the outside. But now, as you mentioned, pork from Germany, this is one market, common market, and if the farms need some kind of protection, you have to turn to the Ministry of Agriculture. We cannot put any barriers in the internal market. This is prohibited. And if we take other analogy, other country might say we are getting in too much cheap timber products. We really have to look at the balance, and the functionality of the common market should be ensured. But in particular cases, or the farm has to turn to the Ministry of Agriculture and look for some kind of solutions to temporary problems. We also Edith Olsinga from the Netherlands and Latvia Trade Chamber. The question is how to resolve non-stable trade with Russia and Belarus. How do we see the development of EU trade relationship with these two countries? Mr. Dombrovskis. Well, here we should underscore that these unstable trade relationships, it's very difficult to isolate them or differentiate them from the unstable political relationships. With respect to Russia, Well, the problems were exacerbated from 2014 when annexation of Crimea, aggression against Ukraine, conflict in eastern Ukraine, and accordingly the EU established sanctions against Russia, and Russia established its countermeasures, including trade embargo. And since then, significant progress in relationship with Russia has not happened. We say no interest on Russia's part to deal with those, to resolve those issues linked to Ukraine. And in general, of course, if we have complicated political relations, then also trade relations are quite complicated. And since 2012, Russia is implementing what they call import substitution policy. So they are attempting to decrease the amount of import in many sectors in a very targeted way, replacing these by locally produced goods. So the situation is very complicated. What can we do? Well, one line of action is more active protection of our own interests, also with respect to those commitments that the third countries, including Russia, have undertaken in the framework of the World Trade Organization. So we want to initiate discussions in the World Trade Organization. We know that many Latvian companies encounter this. Whenever we see some kind of political, perhaps, problems or the disputes with Russia, then immediately some products in Latvia no longer meet standards. So, of course, it's a question how to deal with this Russia's practice. Well, with respect to Belarus, it's not even a member of the World Trade Organization, so, and if we look in general at the EU, the trade amount is quite restricted, quite limited. In Latvia, it is, well, relatively higher, but again, we cannot really take it out of the complex context, because we know the situation in Belarus currently is very complicated. The EU has imposed sanctions against Lukashenko regime because of aggression against civilians demonstrating, and also counterfeiting election results. And again, we won't be able to isolate the trade policy from this very problematic situation in general.
Thank you very much. One very short question from Valdis. He is asking, development of economy is closely linked to energy prices, and EU has undertaken the Green Deal. That means that investments in energy production is going to be big, and thus it will be more expensive than, for example, in Russia and USA, and how we can be competitive within Europe and in exporting outside. Maybe tariff policy is the most important in this issue. So how to survive or how to live with Green Deal, which requires additional expenses from us? Yes, says Mr. Dombrovskis, if we speak about Green Deal and energy efficiency in areas consuming energy, at the moment, this problem is tackled in the following way. These areas or these industries have received free quotas as free emissions. That's why we do not have CO2 leaks, and thus, we will not have goods imported from third countries where these expenses are smaller. Moving towards climate neutrality until 2020, and Latvia was one of the countries signing this initiative. If we go that way, we will not be able to allocate free emissions for those industries, for some industries, and the Commission is preparing a mechanism as how carbon emissions will be taxed or feed on the border, namely carbon border adjustment mechanism. If we cannot allocate free quotas within EU to energy producers, then we have to tax imported goods in order to make the situation leveled. If we speak about trade policy, then an important issue is that these initiatives should be organized in a way that we do not breach regulations and rules set by World Trade Organization. Thank you, Mr. Dombrovskis. We have been talking about trade and international trade for more than an hour, and we have very many questions about agreement with China, about Mercosur agreement. We will not be able to answer online, but all questions will be answered in written. But before I say goodbye, I wanted every speaker to very briefly tell us where do you think international trade is going to. Let's start with Mr. Kols. International trade is at the moment waiting waiting until the 3rd of November, which will be a turning point. EU has defined its priorities, and I don't want to say that we have to speak about strategic autonomy. I think that trade and strategic autonomy is one thing, but there are other things, and we shouldn't be a small grain between US and China. We have to be very pragmatic in our approach. We have to negotiate with China, and China is present in EU, and it really cripples competition because EU players cannot enter China markets so freely, and we have to be more active, and EU Commission should be given a mandate to reach an agreement with China. And the last remark about trade missions, yes, Mr. Dombrovskis, I understand that you have missions. I was talking about exclusive missions, exclusive powers, about people who could deal only with investments, separate institution. I do understand that you do have representations and trade partners, but we shouldn't stop any negotiations with respective trade partners. Zanda, Kalniņa-Lukaševica, a question to you. What do you feel at the moment? How unanimous or how much do you agree with other parliamentary secretaries when you meet them in Brussels? We have many problems in trade policy at the moment, and we have to start solving issues one by one. First of all, we have to diminish trade pressure or negotiation pressure with USA, and we have to go step by step. First step is to find a common ground, speaking about reform of World Trade Organization. Also, we have to find a compromise when electing a new general director for WTO that will help for the implementing of the reform, as well as in our overall negotiations with USA. Speaking about Belarus and Russia, we have to understand that we have entered an age of sanctions, which will not end very soon. because those regimes are breaching international norms, and the best thing we could do, we shouldn't be dependent on those unstable markets. If possible, we should gain profit, but by no means be dependent on them. We have to protect our interests. We should diminish vulnerability of our markets and fight against competition, unfair competition that comes from other countries, including China. And let's stick to the values that we have. We have our trade that is open and based on rules and regulations. Thank you, Madam Kalniņa. Mr. Bergs, what feeling do you have now after what Mr. Dombrovskis said, this new policy, this renewed policy, trade policy? Does it give any hope to you? At the moment, this mechanism consists of too many details. We have to understand some big things. Any business, any entrepreneurship will flourish if international trade is going to be based on rules. It will be fair and open if its internal market is wisely protected. And here I think about quality requirements and mechanisms, that those quality requirements should be met. For example, LED lamps. European market is full of cheap Chinese LED lamps, but there are no mechanisms how to solve this problem, how to verify the quality of it, of those lamps. But also we have to do something by ourselves as well. It depends on how much we are going to invest in our own enterprises, the businessmen, and how much we are going to do by ourselves. Thank you very much. And the final words we give to Valdis Dombrovskis. We have World Trade Organization, China, Brexit, Donald Trump, and COVID. Can we look forward radical changes in European trade policy?
Speaking about the trade policy, well, we are not forecasting radical change. We keep this emphasis on free and rules-based global trade. But of course, we take into account that the context in general is very complicated, as you just mentioned. So we have to reinforce our trade protection instruments. How can we protect our trade and our entrepreneurs against unfair practice of third countries? And we plan to reinforce it also practically. Recently, the position of the main supervisor of trade agreements has been established, and we'll be dealing with all these matters systematically. Also reinforcing the legal base for it. Yesterday we achieved agreement on amendments in the regulation with respect to trade agreement, to meeting the commitments of trade agreements. So the European Union will have other possibilities to turn against third countries if they do not meet their commitments. And we also want to facilitate maximum use of all the advantages given to us by free trade agreements, providing all the information and support to our companies, especially SMEs. With respect to trade agreements, I believe that EU has the best bilateral agreement network in the world. No other country in the world has such network of free trade agreements as we do. Of course, we continue negotiations very actively currently with Australia, New Zealand, China. We have to complete CETA ratification and Mercosur ratification. We have also other negotiations which we have to proceed with at a slower rate. And Also, we have outlined Africa and neighboring countries of the EU for investments. Thank you, Valdis, Dombrovskis, and all our participants of the discussion, all you who watched us, who listened to us, lsm.lv, TVNet, also for streaming this event. But if you still have things you want to say about this trade policy, you still can submit your proposals until the 15th of November. So, and a very nice day to all of you. Thank you. Goodbye.